Think we have a big problem with our federal government? If you do, stay tuned because we at Convention of States have a solution as big as the problem. Our broadcast host is Dale Parrish. He's the Convention of States Indiana State Director. Take it away, Dale.
Well, good evening, everyone. Let me get Debbie off the screen. I don't have her on there quite as yet. But good evening, everyone. My name's Dale Parrish. I'm the state director for Convention of States here in Indiana, just as Maringo Mike told you. And I want to welcome you to our broadcast this evening, COS Indiana Live. So happy to have you here with us this evening. We once again have a very special broadcast for you. Great broadcast tonight. And I want to quickly go over the segments of our broadcast with you. Now, the first segment that we'll get into here very briefly is what we call the topic of discussion segment. And tonight we have with us again our Convention of States super volunteer, Debbie Stewart, is with us tonight to present another chapter in the Constitutional Literacy series. Tonight's chapter will be on the Bill of Rights. And I might as well go ahead and mention to you now, I'll try to mention it again later on in the broadcast, but we plan on bringing Debbie back again next Monday evening, the 30th. And that topic, well, of course, it'll be another chapter in the series of constitutional literacy, but that chapter is going to be on the establishment of religion. So that will be also another very interesting topic in the series of constitutional literacy. That will be our first segment tonight. Then our second segment, I'll go to a PowerPoint presentation that I always use, and we'll give you some general information about Convention of States, some resources that we have available, and just to help you and give you a little information. Then we will get in the next segment, we'll get into the Convention of States basics. These are the three tenets. The basics include the three tenets in Convention of States that our program nationally as well as here in Indiana is based upon. So hopefully you'll find that very interesting and give you a little more background as to what our movement is all about. After we get finished with the basics, then we'll do our best to recognize viewers that we have on tap tonight, those individuals that are tuning in to watch our broadcast this evening. If you have a comment or a question as a viewer, feel free to enter that in the chat section. Keep it short because I'm limited as to the number of characters that I can put up on the screen, but I'll make every effort to put your name up here and your comment or your question if at all possible. The final segment then will be basically the closing, and we'll again mention what we're going to do on our next broadcast. And I have a quote that I like to close every broadcast with, so I'll go over that with you. So those are the segments that we're going to be getting into this evening. As I said, the very first segment is the topic of discussion, and that is tonight going to be another chapter in our series on constitutional literacy. So let me go ahead and bring Debbie into the screen here and let her get started. All right, here we go. There is Debbie. Hi, Debbie.
Hi, Dale. How are you?
Just fine, just fine. Well, Debbie, I think I've pretty well laid the groundwork for you this evening on the Bill of Rights. So if you would like to get started, let me put the Bill of Rights up there and you can take it away.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we are in Michael Ferris's Constitutional Literacy book, and we're talking about, does the Bill of Rights apply to the states? Does the federal Bill of Rights apply to the states? And so the question is, which levels of government are required to obey the federal Bill of Rights? Now, we know the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments of our federal Constitution, and so we're talking about those 10 amendments. And so, but before we do, let's talk a little bit about the objectives of this little chapter here.
All right.
Okay, the first one is we want to understand the issues surrounding the question of whether or not states are limited to the U.S. Bill of Rights. We want to recognize what impact did the 14th Amendment have on that decision, and also what were some of the leaps and steps taken by the Supreme Court to remove autonomy, some of the autonomy of the states. So with that said, let's go ahead and just a couple definitions here or terms that will be maybe mentioned in this chapter. Is the first one is incorporation doctrine, and it's the principle that the 14th Amendment makes portions of the Bill of Rights applicable to the states. Prior to the creation of the incorporation doctrine, the Bill of Rights applied only to the federal government actions. So we're going to talk about what happened. Why is that different today? Okay, and then one more term is just when we talk about states' rights, it's the doctrine whereby the power of the individual states are preserved and protected from interference by the federal government. So as we probably mentioned earlier, that if you drew two circles, the original founders of our Constitution, our country, meant for the federal government circle to be small and the state governments to be larger. So the states should be much more autonomous and run themselves. But what's happened is they've kind of flip-flopped. Now the circle for the states is very small and the federal government, and we're even seeing that happen right before our eyes with everything that's going on in our country is getting bigger and bigger.
That happens to be when I get into the COS basics, the Convention of States basics, that happens to be one of the abuses by the federal government that we've identified. Like you said, when the country was founded, there was a concept in place called dual federalism, whereby the federal government and the states shared power, shared power. Well, as we know, that has the scale has tilted just pretty much all in favor of the federal government. So that is an area that in Convention of States that we want to see addressed through an amendment to the Constitution. Now we think the career politician plays a big role in this, and so term limits is the area or the item that we would like to see the Constitution be amended to address. But just thought I'd mention that since you went into that, that is an area that our movement wants to address.
That's interesting. So you don't really trust our legislatures in Washington, D.C. to put term limits on themselves?
Oh, sure. I'm sure that they'll do that anytime now.
I think that's on the docket for next week after they solve the coronavirus thing.
Right. No, that is a very good point. They will never do that. And they will never do a number of the things that we're wanting to see done, and that's why we think a Convention of States is the only solution available. We're going to have to force them to do these things.
Absolutely, and who was the man who came up with the idea? What was his name again? In the one that originally put it into the Constitution. Do you remember?
Oh yeah, George Mason.
Yeah, Mason, that's it. Yeah.
In, Article 5.
He was smart enough to look ahead.
He knew it was very, very smart of him. Yes, very George Mason, and he knew that the day was going to come where the federal government was going to be so powerful that it would not do this for itself. It would be up to the people to get things like this accomplished. So, good point. Good point.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Bill of Rights and the original intent. So the drafters of the Constitution, their original intent was that the federal Bill of Rights would apply only to the federal government. And you could really ask a lot of scholars that study the Constitution. They all agree that that was the original intent. So it's just interesting. The original purpose of the Federal Bill of Rights was protect the people's rights from the centralized power of the federal government, not to limit the power of state and local governments. But somehow it's being turned on the local and state governments, and it's limiting their power. How does that happen? So it's all these mini steps along the way. And so so that leads us into, and I'm not going to go through all the cases because that would take us a while, but there was just this stair-stepping of several cases where when there was a state issue that came up and it went to the federal courts, they said, we're not even going to look at this. This is outside of jurisdiction. You handle it in your state. And that had been happening all along. But then the 14th Amendment came along. Okay, and so I think, is this the illogical argument? Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Okay. When the 14th Amendment was adopted in 1868, it really had a lot to do with African Americans and them getting rights. And so the 14th Amendment specifically addressed the powers of the state and local governments in ways that the Constitution never had, because they wanted to make sure that the states were treating the African Americans with equal protection, all the freedoms they should deserve. And so, so there was that thing that happened with the 14th Amendment. But it's interesting that the interpretation that the 14th Amendment was really to make some of the Bill of Rights apply to the states didn't show up until the 1920s. So for some reason, we missed that interpretation for 60 some years. And then all of a sudden the Supreme Court decided, you know what? I think we feel like the 14th Amendment means that some of those things should apply, some of the Bill of Rights should apply to the states. So it was very illogical. They really couldn't explain it, but they kind of ruled on that. And there were some more cases that happened. But the key thing that happened was in 1925, there was a case called Gitlow versus New York. And in this case, a man named Gitlow, he challenged what he was getting in trouble for, but he challenged and he went to the federal courts. And so what happened was, it was the first time that the Supreme Court actually took a case that was outside their jurisdiction. So the consequence was, it was the Supreme Court actually elected to hear the case rather than throwing it out, which is what they had normally done before. Okay, so it was the very first time the Supreme Court held that the First Amendment did indeed apply to the states. And so what happened is, now our current situation is so crazy. You would think, okay, well then they picked a few of the amendments to apply to the states and then the rest still apply to the federal government, right? But they didn't. They took the Fifth Amendment and they even split the Fifth Amendment up. So there's 5 main clauses in there. So several of the clauses apply to the states and several do not. And so somebody kind of made these decisions along the way. And now it's as if it was actually put into the document. And it's interesting that now when we rule in our courts, that's just the assumption that's made. So it's one more example of how things get passed down, and there's a judicial overreach, and then we take it as law.
Right.
You know, we take it as that's the rule.
Yeah.
And then, so the next part was the devolution of states' rights, which is what happened. So now the states were having to obey certain parts of the federal Constitution, or the Federal Bill of Rights. And they no longer were throwing out cases for lack of jurisdiction. So, did you have any questions at all, Dale, at all? I know I've just been talking really fast because
no, you're doing fine. You're doing fine.
Okay, so the result is that now, even though the original intent was that the states would not, because what do the states use if they don't use the Federal Bill of Rights? Well, every state has their own Bill of Rights and their own constitution, so they don't really need the Federal Bill of Rights. But through the series of years and cases and rulings, now the states are required to obey certain parts of the Federal Bill of Rights. And so the power is being taken away from the states and limiting them more and more, as we talked about earlier. So, but not all of the Bill of Rights. So, yeah. only some.
I think your point, maybe we need to do a discussion topic, or maybe you're going to do this in one of your upcoming chapters, but your point about how some of the decisions by the Supreme Court are treated as if they're law.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the decisions of the Supreme Court are really based upon intent from another case or another ruling.
Right.
And it's really interesting how convoluted that has become. And I don't know if one of your future chapters will get into that, but let me know. If not, I think we could make make that a topic of discussion for one of our future broadcasts, just dealing with the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Okay.
So no, let's talk about that. And I know I just read something recently where they were talking, there's a name for that, where they now look at recent cases. And I know precedent, but there's a term that is used. I just thought that was normal, but it's really not. You're supposed to go back to original intent with a lot of things, but the precedent cases are superseding what the original intent is. And there's a name for that. I'm not a law person. I don't remember what that is, but I was shocked to go, oh, wow, this is not supposed to be happening. Like, we're not even supposed to be leaning on precedent that much. So, but
yeah. Okay.
In conclusion, we know that the states now are limited much more. And it's interesting, it's become such commonplace that even Justice Antonin Scalia, who's a big original intent guy, he's resigned to he's not alive anymore, but he was resigned to the idea that portions of the Bill of Rights now apply to the states, even though he believes in original intent. So it's just kind of like, it's what everybody's doing. It's kind of like, our legislators in Washington, D.C., where everybody just starts to do things a certain way, and that's how they think it should be then. They just...
Yeah. All right. Wrap it up then. All right.
Yeah, that's it. And so go Convention of States, because we need to address these issues, and we need to do something quickly. And we need to get the rest of those. Let's see, we've got how many? 14 states now?
15. We have 15 now, and we're looking for. We still think 2020 is going to be a big year for us.
Okay.
It was thought a few months ago that we might possibly get an additional 10 states this year. So
okay, and that's what we need, 10 more to get to 34, right?
Well, we would need 15. We would need what, another 14, 9 more. 9.
Yeah, 9 more. Yeah, sorry. Okay, awesome. Well, we need to make
15. Geez, my goodness, I can't even do the math anymore.
Because we need 34 for the convention, and is it 30 for ratifying, right?
Right, 34 for the convention. So we need 19 more states.
19 more. Okay, yeah. Well, that was wishful thinking. 9 more.
Yes, 19 more states, 34 to hold the convention, 38 to ratify any proposed amendment that would come out of the convention. So, all right, Debbie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you next Monday evening.
I can't wait.
And the establishment of religion. And then if plans hold true, we're going to give Debbie a break here in the month of April, and perhaps not even have her back on until May. We'll see how that goes.
Okay.
So, Debbie, thank you very much.
You're welcome. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Have a good evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, folks. Always enjoy Debbie coming on with one of her chapters. We really do enjoy that, and they're always very, very good. Let me bring up my PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to be sure to take all the steps here so that you can actually see this very well. I didn't do this right in our last broadcast, so you should be able to hear me now. Still hear me, and I'm going to initiate the slideshow option so that you can see the full screen. All right. Let's get into now just some general information that I wanted to provide to you. This is the second segment. Our national website, conventionofstates.com. This is a very, very important website, very important to the administration of our program, even at the state level. And this is our national website, like I said, conventionofstates.com. If you want to get involved in Convention of States, this is the very first step you should take. Go to this website, open an account, sign the petition, and you will then become a supporter. Now, there's a wealth of information on this website, wealth of information from an educational standpoint that'll give you some good information on our movement. Now, embedded in that national website is our state website page, conventionofstates.com/Indiana, obviously focused on our state. If you're a social media person, we're on Facebook is our main platform, and we have a state Facebook page, Convention of States, Indiana. Matter of fact, this broadcast is coming to you this evening through that Facebook page. YouTube channel, COS Indiana, very much an educational resource for you. We have a number of narrated PowerPoint presentations on that channel. We have recordings of our broadcast. This one will be on there tomorrow. And then we have links to a podcast that gentleman Paul Phillips, who you have seen on these broadcasts a number of times. Paul does a podcast called The Free to Be Free, and we have links to each of his podcasts. So I would encourage you to check those out. They're very, very good. Twitter, #COS Indiana, Instagram, LinkedIn. We're on, like I said, a number of different platforms. So if you're into social media, you should not have any problem finding us. Let me give you some quick numbers. In 2019, we went past 41,000 supporters in the state of Indiana, been growing at a tremendous rate. We've set our goal for 2020 to be 52,000 supporters by the end of this year. About 2,900 individuals have volunteered in one way or another, and we have about 40 individuals in leadership positions. Now, this is very important. If you're interested in getting more involved in Convention of States, I would encourage you, once again here, go to this national website, conventionofstates.com, click on the menu selection, Take Action, scroll down to where it says Become a Leader, and look at the different volunteer positions that we have available. If one is of interest to you, open it up, read about it. Go ahead and make application. You're not obligated in any way. But what that does then is your name then comes up on our report every day that I see, as well as a few others. One of us then will be in contact with you to discuss further your interest in that particular position. We would love to have your involvement. We need leaders. So please, if you're interested at all, go to conventionofstates.com, click on Take Action, and take a look at the positions that we have available. All right, let's get into now the next segment, which is the basics of Convention of States. And the basics, as I mentioned, there are three tenets. That's the problem, the solution, and the plan. Now, the problem basically is that we believe our federal government lacks the will and the courage to address some basic structural issues in our government and in our country. Now, we have further defined the problem into three abuses that we see happening. The first abuse is our national debt. And as you know, it's over $23 trillion now. Unfunded liabilities, some estimates, I've heard 140 trillion. I've also heard over 200 trillion. Anyway, very little is being done to address this situation, and specifically our national debt. So that's the first abuse. The second abuse is the regulatory crisis. And as we know, the administrative state is now considered the fourth branch of government. I know the current administration has been making some progress on eliminating certain regulations, but much, much more needs to be done in this area, especially in the area of how these regulations are created in the first place. The last abuse has to do kind of well, it has to do a lot with what Debbie was saying in her presentation. That when our country was founded, there was a concept in place called dual federalism, where the federal government and the states would share power. Well, that, as Debbie pointed out, that has tilted all pretty much in the favor of the federal government. Now, we believe the career politician plays a big role in this, and that's why in our third abuse, we want to see term limits imposed, term limits on Congress, as well as the federal judiciary, and I would also say officials involved in Congress and the federal judiciary. All right, our second tenet of the basics of Convention of States is the solution. Now, we believe the solution is right there in Article 5 of the Constitution. Now, we're not making this up. Article 5 describes two methods of amending the Constitution. We'll touch on those very briefly here. Two methods to amend the Constitution. One we're very used to seeing and knowing about, but the second has not been used, and that's what we're all about. Now, the first method, of course, is where 2/3 of Congress proposes an amendment to be made to the Constitution. Then that amendment has to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, which would be 38 states. All right. If ratified, then it becomes an amendment to the Constitution. Well, the second method described in Article 5, it's right there, and that is where 2/3 of the state legislatures apply to conduct a convention of states for the purpose of proposing amendments to the Constitution. That's what we're all about. Any proposed amendments that would come out of that convention would then once again have to be ratified, just as in method one, would have to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, or 38 states. So this is what we want to see happen. We want to see a convention of states occur to propose amendments that would address those abuses that we identified in the problem section. Now, what's our plan to bring this about? Well, our plan's in two parts. The first part has to do with the application strategy. 34 states need to make application to hold this convention, and we want the application to be the one that we have designed, whereby the subject matter of that application, and I might mention, all the applications, the subject matter has to be the same. They can't be different subject matters. The subject matter has to be the same for all the applications. And we want to see the application to address fiscal restraints, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and term limits. The subject matter of the application, which they all have to be the same, will determine the agenda of the convention. So that's the first part of our strategy of the plan. And the other part, the next part of the plan, is mobilizing the grassroots, and that's mobilizing the citizens and our state legislators. That's you, me, and our state legislators to bring this about. So as you can tell, in Indiana, we have a great amount of support, and our movement is really gaining momentum. We're legislatively in all 50 states now, and we believe that this is going to come about. We just need to get to 34 states. We have 15 states right now, and yes, Indiana is one of the 15 states that has passed the application, or the resolution, it's also called. So we would love to have your involvement, and if you want to get involved in Convention of States, as I mentioned, go to that national website, conventionofstates.com, and look at open an account and get involved with us. We would love to have your involvement. All right, let's get ready now, and let me go back here and bring my PowerPoint off, and let's see if we have who we have tuning in tonight. Well, I see we have a couple of not a couple, but she's speaking on behalf of her and her husband. That's Rick and Susan Lyon. Wishing everyone to be well and stay safe. So yes, in today's time, it's important for us to be safe. There's no doubt about that. Let me see. She's also I'm a little late in getting this up here. She said, "Great job, Debbie." So. Susan has made another comment here. I don't know if I can get it all on here. I'll try. There it is. Yeah, we notice that Trump is trying to empower the states to coordinate equally with him in fighting the coronavirus. Yes, yes. So, Susan, thank you very much for tuning in tonight. And we will, as I said, we try to recognize our viewers as much as possible. So let's now close things. Let's bring up what I like to use as my closing for every broadcast. Now, before I get into this, I do want to mention that once again, that Debbie will be back with us again next Monday evening for another chapter of constitutional literacy. And Debbie will be talking about the establishment of religion in that chapter. So look forward. So please put that on your calendar and plan on joining us next Monday evening. Well, in closing, I love this quote by one of our co-founders and currently president of Convention of States, Mr. Mark Meckler. And Mark's quote is that there is a fundamental question facing our country today. And that question is not what should we do? The question really is who will decide? So yes, the question facing us is a two-word question, very simply, who decides? We believe we, the people, should have a more of a say-so in making these decisions in our federal government and making the decisions that affect us in our state and our local level. So once again, I want to ask, if you want to get involved in Convention of States, go to our national website, conventionofstates.com. Take a look at open an account and sign the petition. Become a supporter. That gets you involved. You being a supporter is very, very important. Believe me, it's very, very important when we talk to state legislators and we can show them the individuals in their respective district who's a supporter of our movement. So that's very powerful. So being a supporter, you're involved, all right? And if you have any inclination to maybe take on a leadership role, we encourage you to look at those. Now, we have leadership positions that require various degrees of time. Obviously, there are some that require much more time than others. So look and see if there's something that fits your schedule, all right? So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Wish you all a very, very good evening, especially during this lockdown period. I was telling Debbie before the broadcast started this evening that I think one of the worst things you could do during this lockdown is to watch the news all day long. I'll tell you, the news will just drive you crazy. So I would encourage you, if you have a trusted news source, you might plan on checking in with that source maybe once a day. Otherwise, try and find something to do so that you're not watching the news all day long. It'll drive you crazy. Okay, I got off base a little bit. Okay. Anyway, Everyone, have a pleasant evening. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Look forward to seeing you next Monday evening. Good night, everyone.